The planet Xylo was a realm of enigmatic energies and potent forces, a world where the sky shimmered with an amethyst luminescence and the air carried a tang of something exotic, something unfamiliar. Humans were newcomers to Xylo, dispatched on a mission to establish peaceful relations with the extraterrestrial civilizations that held dominion over the galaxy. Yet, even before their arrival, the planet's most formidable leader had already attained notoriety. She was known throughout the galaxy as Supreme Regent Lyra. Lyra, a commanding figure of impressive stature and strength, possessed skin that gleamed with a silvery sheen. Her eyes, radiating an unusual emerald light, seemed capable of penetrating walls, piercing the very essence of a being. Her reign was absolute, unwavering, and no challenge to her authority was ever tolerated. She was a true leader, revered by all, and held in awe by many. Yet, despite her immense power, she remained solitary. Elias, a human soldier, had encountered tales of the Supreme Regent before setting foot on Xylo. Everyone had cautioned him about her aloof nature, describing her as detached, impassive, a paragon of leadership impervious to sentiment. No one had ever witnessed a smile grace her lips, nor did anyone dare approach her. She was perpetually encircled by her guard, perpetually composed, perpetually flawless. Upon their initial encounter, Elias was struck by her aura. In person, she was even more imposing, her penetrating gaze scrutinizing him, searching for any vulnerability, any trace of apprehension. But Elias stood firm, recalling his training. He was there on a mission, not to be cowed by an alien leader. Their initial meeting adhered to strict formality. He stood at attention, back erect, his gaze locked onto hers. Lyra's stare was unwavering, as though she were meticulously studying him, her lips pressed together, revealing no emotion. It felt as if she were dissecting every fiber of his being, seeking any leverage, any advantage. Elias, however, maintained his ground. "You are the human emissary?" Her voice was measured, composed, yet with an underlying edge. "Yes, Supreme Regent," Elias responded, his voice steady. "You will adhere to the laws of this planet. You will respect our customs, or you will not depart from this place alive," she declared, her eyes fixed on his. Her words were a clear, unambiguous warning. Elias didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Understood, Supreme Regent," he replied, maintaining his composure. Over the subsequent days, Elias's team collaborated closely with the Xylosian forces, engaging in diplomatic discussions and exchanging intelligence. The Supreme Regent was ever present, observing, waiting. She rarely spoke, but her presence was pervasive. It was as though she possessed the ability to make the atmosphere around her dense, as if she commanded every moment. Elias couldn't help but notice her. Despite her aloofness, there was an undeniable allure about her. She never displayed a smile, never revealed vulnerability. She embodied everything a leader should be, yet it was apparent she carried a burden, a weight upon her shoulders that Elias could almost sense from afar. There was something behind her eyes, a hint of melancholy, or perhaps solitude, that she attempted to conceal. One evening, after a protracted day of negotiations, Elias found himself strolling alone near the Supreme Regent's headquarters. The sky was a deep violet hue, stars shimmering like celestial jewels. He had merely intended to take in the fresh air, but as he walked, he caught sight of her. Lyra stood alone on a balcony, overlooking the city. Her posture was impeccable, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon. It was almost as if she hadn't noticed his presence. Elias paused, unsure how to proceed. Should he speak? Should he simply depart? Yet, something compelled him to remain. There was something about her that drew him in, a desire to understand her more deeply. As he stood there, he detected a fleeting expression in her eyes. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. For a brief instant, she appeared vulnerable. It was as if she were unsure of herself, her mask of composure slipping ever so slightly, revealing a glimpse of the person hidden beneath. Elias was about to speak when she turned towards him. Her expression had returned to its customary coolness, but there was a subtle difference in her eyes, a look that quickened his pulse. She knew he had been observing her, and in that moment, he realized she might not be as unfeeling as everyone believed. "You have inquiries," she said, her voice hushed, almost as if speaking to herself. Elias was initially speechless, taken aback that she had acknowledged him, let alone spoken. But something in her words prompted him to inquire further. "Are you content?" The words escaped his lips before he could restrain them. Lyra's eyes flickered, perhaps with surprise. It was a question she clearly hadn't anticipated. For a moment, she remained silent, her lips tightening as her gaze returned to the city below. "Do you believe I should be?" she responded, her voice tinged with a hint of bitterness. It was the first time Elias had heard any emotion from her that wasn't cold or commanding. Elias was at a loss for an answer. The question hung in the air between them. He didn't know what to say, but he sensed there was much more to this enigmatic supreme regent than anyone realized. He felt a strange stirring within him. The planet Zorth pulsed with arcane energies, a world where the violet sky shimmered and the air held an unfamiliar, pungent scent. Humanity's arrival was recent, their mission, to forge a peaceful alliance with the galactic civilizations. But even before their ships landed, the planet's formidable leader, Commander Zara, had achieved interstellar renown. Zara, a figure of commanding presence, possessed skin that shone with a silvery luminescence. Her emerald eyes, unnervingly intense, seemed to pierce through matter itself, discerning the very essence of those before her. Her rule was absolute, brooking no dissent. She was a paragon of leadership, revered and, by many, feared. Yet, this potent leader remained utterly solitary. The human soldier, Jace, had heard whispers of Commander Zara before arriving on Zorth. He was warned of her aloof demeanor, her impassivity, her unwavering devotion to duty. No one had ever witnessed a smile touch her lips, and none dared to approach her. Constantly flanked by her guard, she was the epitome of control, impeccably composed, seemingly flawless. Their initial encounter left Jace awestruck. Zara's presence was even more formidable in person. Her piercing gaze swept over him, assessing, probing for weakness or apprehension. Jace stood firm, recalling his training. He was there on a mission, not to be intimidated. The meeting was strictly formal. Jace stood at attention, his gaze locked with hers. Zara's scrutiny was unwavering, her lips pressed into a thin line, revealing nothing. Jace felt as though she were dissecting his very being, searching for any advantage. He held his ground. "You are the human envoy?" Her voice, though measured and composed, carried an underlying sharpness. "Yes, Commander," Jace replied, his voice steady. "You will abide by the laws of this planet. You will observe our customs, or you will not leave this world," she stated, her gaze unwavering. The warning was unmistakable. Jace didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Understood, Commander," he replied, maintaining his composure. Over the following days, Jace's team worked alongside the Zorthian forces, engaging in diplomatic talks and sharing information. Commander Zara was a constant presence, observing, waiting. She spoke rarely, but her influence pervaded every interaction. The air around her seemed to thicken, each moment under her control. Jace found his attention drawn to her. Despite her aloofness, she possessed an undeniable magnetism. Her perpetual composure, her unwavering strength, hinted at a hidden burden, a weight Jace could almost sense. He glimpsed something in her eyes, a fleeting melancholy, perhaps loneliness, that she diligently concealed. One evening, following a long day of negotiations, Jace found himself walking near Commander Zara's headquarters. The sky was a deep violet, the stars scattered like gems across the expanse. He'd simply sought some fresh air, but as he walked, he saw her. Zara stood alone on a balcony, overlooking the city. Her posture was impeccable, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She seemed oblivious to his presence. Jace hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Should he speak? Should he simply turn back? Yet, some unseen force held him there. There was something about her that compelled him to stay, a desire to understand the enigma she presented. As he watched, he detected a fleeting shift in her expression. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. For a brief instant, a flicker of vulnerability crossed her face. It was as if her carefully constructed mask had slipped, revealing a glimpse of the person beneath. He was about to speak when she turned toward him. Her expression had returned to its customary coolness, but a subtle shift in her eyes, a flicker of awareness, made his pulse quicken. She knew he had been watching her, and in that moment, Jace realized that perhaps she was not as impervious as everyone believed. "You have something to ask?" Her voice was hushed, almost a whisper. Jace was momentarily speechless, surprised that she had acknowledged him. But something in her tone encouraged him to speak. "Do you find contentment?" The words escaped before he could stop them. Zara's eyes flickered, a hint of surprise evident. It was a question she hadn't anticipated. For a moment, she remained silent, her lips tightening as she looked back at the city below. "Should I?" she finally responded, a touch of bitterness in her voice. It was the first time Jace had heard anything but cold command in her tone. Jace struggled to find an answer. The question hung between them. He didn't know what to say, but he knew there was more to this enigmatic commander than met the eye. A strange feeling stirred within him. He felt compelled to learn more. The days continued to unfold on Zorth, each one tinged with a subtle tension that Jace couldn't quite shake. Time seemed to warp around his interactions with Commander Zara. It had only been a handful of days since their unusual exchange on the balcony, yet something had shifted. The image of the seemingly impervious commander, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face, remained imprinted in his mind. He couldn't dispel the notion that there was more to her than the cold, untouchable leader everyone described. Every encounter, whether a formal meeting or a fleeting moment in the corridors, Jace noticed a change in her gaze. It was as if she were observing him intently, searching for something, or perhaps searching within herself. Her eyes held an intensity that made his pulse quicken, yet he couldn't bring himself to look away. Commander Zara hadn't spoken to him directly again since that night. She maintained her usual demeanor, sharp, professional, and utterly focused on her duties. Yet, a palpable distance surrounded her, an isolation Jace could almost feel. It was as though an invisible barrier separated her from everyone else, a wall she seemed unwilling, or perhaps unable, to cross. Then, one evening, it happened again. Jace was returning to his quarters after a lengthy meeting with Zorthian officials. The moon cast a sliver of light across the city, the air cool and quiet. As he passed Commander Zara's headquarters, he saw her. She was alone on the balcony, as before. This time, however, something felt different. She wasn't gazing out at the cityscape. Her eyes were downcast, lost in thought. The usually impenetrable facade seemed to crack, and for a fleeting moment, she appeared human. Not the formidable alien commander, but simply a person burdened by something unseen. Jace hesitated. He could turn back, retreat to the safety of his quarters, and try to forget what he'd seen. But an irresistible force kept him rooted to the spot. He needed to understand. Without conscious thought, he found himself walking towards her. His footsteps were quiet on the stone floor, but he knew she would sense his approach. When he reached the balcony, he paused. She hadn't noticed him yet. "Commander," he said softly. Zara stiffened, her body tensing at the sound of his voice. She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized him. "You again," she said, a familiar coldness in her tone. Yet, Jace detected something else in her eyes, a flicker of something that gave him pause. "You shouldn't be here," she continued, her voice still cool but with a subtle crack, a hint of uncertainty he hadn't heard before. I wanted to talk," Jace said, taking a step closer, but maintaining a respectful distance. Zara's gaze shifted uncomfortably. She turned away from him, leaning against the railing and looking out at the city, her arms crossed defensively. "There's nothing to talk about," she said flatly. But Jace could see the conflict in her eyes, the doubt she was trying so hard to conceal. He took a deep breath. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I just want to understand." For a long moment, Commander Zara remained silent, her back still turned. Jace thought she might simply dismiss him. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke. "You think you understand me?" Her voice was softer now, almost vulnerable. "You think you can just walk in and figure me out?" Jace felt his pulse quicken. "I don't know if I can," he admitted honestly. "But I think there's more to you than what everyone says." Zara's lips tightened. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to decipher his true intentions. "More?" she asked skeptically. "What could possibly be more?" Jace hesitated. He wasn't sure how to phrase it, but he felt compelled to be honest. "You're not like the stories," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You're not just a leader, cold and without feeling. I can see it in your eyes, Commander. You don't want to be alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Zara's face tightened, her usual mask of control slipping for just an instant. Her eyes darted away, and for a moment, she looked lost. "I've never needed anyone," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "I've always been alone. It's the only way I know how to survive." Jace didn't know what to say. He'd always known Commander Zara was strong, but this was different. She wasn't just a leader, she was a person, with fears and insecurities just like anyone else. And for the first time, he could see it clearly. "I don't think you're alone," he said softly, his voice steady. "You don't have to be." Commander Zara didn't answer. She simply stood there, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The silence stretched between them, but for the first time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand, human. You can't." Jace wasn't sure what to say to that. But he knew one thing, something had changed. The commander wasn't the same cold, unfeeling leader he had first met. There was more to her, something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. And despite the dangers, despite the walls she had built around herself, Jace couldn't help but feel drawn to her. The question was, would she let him in? The days continued to unfold on Sorth, a subtle tension pervading Jace's every interaction with Commander Zara. It had only been a short time since their exchange on the balcony, but the atmosphere had palpably shifted. The image of the seemingly untouchable commander, that flicker of vulnerability across her face, was imprinted in Jace's memory. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than the cold, aloof leader everyone perceived. In every encounter, whether a formal meeting or a fleeting moment in a corridor, Jace noticed a change in her gaze. It was as though she were observing him intently, searching, questioning. Her eyes held an intensity that made his pulse quicken, yet he couldn't bring himself to look away. Commander Zara hadn't spoken to him directly again since that night. She maintained her usual sharp, professional, and utterly focused demeanor. Yet, a palpable isolation clung to her, a loneliness that Jace could almost feel. An invisible barrier seemed to separate her from everyone, a wall she seemed unwilling, or perhaps unable, to cross. Then, one evening, it happened again. Jace was returning to his quarters after a lengthy strategy session with Zorthian officials. The moon bathed the city in a silvery light, the air was cool and quiet. As he passed Commander Zara's headquarters, he saw her. She was alone on the balcony, as before. This time, however, her gaze wasn't fixed on the cityscape. Her eyes were downcast, lost in thought. The normally impenetrable facade seemed to crack, and for a fleeting moment, she appeared human. Not the formidable alien commander, but simply a person burdened by some unseen weight. Jace hesitated. He could turn back, retreat to the safety of his quarters, and try to forget what he'd seen. But an irresistible force held him in place. He needed to understand. Without conscious thought, he found himself walking towards her. His footsteps were quiet, but he knew she would sense his approach. When he reached the balcony, he paused. She hadn't noticed him yet. "Commander," he said softly. Zara stiffened, her body tensing at the sound of his voice. She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized him. "You again," she said, her voice laced with its familiar coldness. Yet, Jace detected something else beneath the surface, a flicker of something that gave him pause. "You shouldn't be here," she continued, her voice still cool, but laced with a subtle tremor, a hint of uncertainty. I wanted to talk," Jace said, taking a step closer while maintaining a respectful distance. Zara shifted uncomfortably, turning away from him to lean against the railing. She crossed her arms defensively as she stared out at the city. "There's nothing to talk about," she said, her voice flat. But Jace could see the conflict in her eyes, the doubt she was trying so desperately to conceal. He took a deep breath. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I just want to understand." For a long moment, Commander Zara remained silent, her back still turned. Jace thought she might dismiss him. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke. "You think you understand me?" Her voice was softer now, almost vulnerable. "You think you can just walk in and dissect my thoughts?" Jace felt his heart quicken. "I don't know if I can," he admitted honestly. "But I believe there's more to you than what people see." Zara's lips tightened. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "More?" she asked skeptically. "What more could there possibly be?" Jace hesitated. He wasn't sure how to phrase it, but he felt compelled to be truthful. "You're not the person the stories paint you to be," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You're not just a leader, cold and unfeeling. I can see it, Commander. You carry a burden." The words hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Zara's face tightened, a usual mask of control faltering for just a fleeting moment. Her eyes darted away, and for a moment, she looked utterly lost. "I've never needed anyone," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always been alone. It's how I've survived." Jace didn't know what to say. He had always known Commander Zara was strong, but this was different. She wasn't just a leader, she was a person, burdened by unseen struggles, just like anyone else. And for the first time, he saw her clearly. "I don't think you are alone," he said softly, his voice steady. "You don't have to be." Commander Zara didn't answer. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The silence stretched between them, but for the first time, it wasn't strained. It was understanding. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't understand, human. You simply can't." Jace wasn't sure how to respond. But he knew one thing, something had shifted. The commander wasn't the same cold, impenetrable leader he had first met. There was more to her, something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. And despite the potential dangers, despite the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself, Jace couldn't help but feel drawn to her. The question was, would she let him in? The days that followed were a blur of quiet anxieties. Jace couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental had shifted between him and Commander Zara. The simple touch they shared, the brush of her fingers against his, lingered in his mind like a promise, a glimpse of something deeper. For the first time, Zara had lowered her guard, if only for a fleeting moment, and it had felt like the world had tilted on its axis. As he moved through the corridors of the Zorthian headquarters, his heart beat a rapid rhythm against his ribs. The coming hours would decide whether the fragile connection they forged would blossom or wither. Uncertainty hung heavy in the air, but a thread of hope wove through it. For the first time, Jace was unsure where this path would lead, and it both terrified and exhilarated him. As he approached her quarters again, he hesitated. Would she be ready to take the next step, or would she retreat behind her meticulously constructed walls? His knuckles rapped softly against the door, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs. The door opened almost instantly, revealing Zara. Her eyes held a weariness, yet her expression was softer, the usual coldness replaced by a flicker of vulnerability. She remained silent, but stepped aside, a silent invitation. Jace entered, his thoughts a maelstrom of possibilities. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy in the air between them. He turned to face her, his voice hushed with emotion. "Commander, Please, she interrupted, her voice almost a plea, not yet. Jay stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes held a vulnerability that made him want to reach out, to offer comfort. He saw the internal struggle, the turmoil she was experiencing because of what was unfolding between them. Her fear was palpable, and he understood. He had felt it too. But now, more than ever, he knew he couldn't retreat. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, taking a step closer. "I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Zara searched his face for a long moment, as if searching for something hidden within his gaze. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never allowed myself to feel this way about anyone. I've always kept my emotions controlled. But with you, it's different." Jace's heart soared. She was acknowledging it, admitting that what they felt was real. "I know," he whispered. "I feel it too. And I don't want to hide it anymore." Zara's eyes softened, but uncertainty still clouded her expression. "I don't know if I can trust you, Jace. I don't know if I can trust myself." Jace stepped forward and gently took her hand. Her touch was warm, and he felt the tension in her body as she hesitated. "You don't have to trust everything right away," he said. "We can take it one step at a time." Silence descended upon the room, thick and heavy with uncertainty. Then, with a sigh, Zara's shoulders relaxed. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her strength. When she opened them again, something had shifted. A spark of hope, a flicker of something genuine, shone through. "Okay," she whispered, "let's take that step." A wave of relief washed over Jace. He gently drew her closer, his hands resting on her arms as he gazed into her eyes. The walls that had seemed so insurmountable were slowly crumbling. He still saw the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there now, too, trust. "I won't push you, Commander," Jace said softly. "But I'll be here, no matter what." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Her breath was steady now, and as she reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers trembled slightly. She was afraid, but she was willing to take the risk. Jace's heart beat faster as she leaned in, her lips a hair's breadth from his. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The world outside faded away, and it was just the two of them, poised on the precipice of something unknown, yet breathtakingly beautiful. And then she kissed him. It was a tentative kiss, slow and gentle, as if testing the waters. But in that moment, Jace felt the weight of everything that had passed between them, all the unspoken words and hidden emotions, and the promise of what could be. When they finally pulled away, their foreheads rested against each other, their breaths mingling. They were both breathing heavily, as if they had just crossed a threshold, one neither could return from. And neither wanted to. For the first time in a long time, Jace didn't feel alone. And Zara, for the first time, wasn't hiding. "We're taking a chance," she whispered, her voice soft but certain. Jace smiled, his hand still intertwined with hers. "I know. But I think it's worth it." Zara nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Me too." And with that, they both knew this was just the beginning. They had taken a chance on each other, and though the path ahead might be uncertain, they would face it together.